It's my pleasure to introduce to you this morning our featured speaker for the second day of convocations. Dr. Rodney Frey is an anthropologist and director of the Lewis and Clark College Center in Coeur d'Alene. He has a very impressive academic record and he's published widely. Making that statement, I just eliminated his whole vita. What Dr. Frey stresses, however, is his love of Indian culture and the contributions Indians have made to his education and to his life. He attributes much of what he knows to on-the-job training, from his experiences with various Indian and tribal groups, to particular elders within the Indian community teaching him the art of storytelling. The topic of this morning's presentation is Telling One's Own, Oral Literature, Storytelling, and the Contemporary American Indian. And Dr. Frey will emphasize Northwest Indians in his presentation this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rodney Frey.
Good morning. It's a pleasure being here. And I do want to thank David for the introduction, as well as Jean Ann Mitchell for helping arrange this, and just the entire convocation week. It's really quite a success and a pleasure being here. And thank you very much. I'd like to share some thoughts with you today concerning ways of seeing the world around us, and ways of participating in that which we see. The ways I speak of are grounded in and originate out of the American Indian experience. There's an old story, an ancient story, that's been told widely. It was told by the Kootenai and the Nez Perce. It was told by the Cheyenne. And it goes something like this. It has to do with seeing and participating. There's an old man, and he's standing right here. He stands right here beside this tall cedar tree. And as he stands here beside that tree, he sings a song. He's singing this song. And as he sings that song, as he's standing right here, his eyes pop out of his head. His eyeballs just pop right out of his head and fly the top branch of that tree up there. Right up there. And there, those eyeballs look in the four directions. They look to the east. The eyeballs look to the south, to the west, and to the north. They look in the four directions, but only in the four directions. As the old man stands there beside that cedar tree, who should come up but Coyote? Coyote there. See him there? Coyote sees the old man. Coyote sees the old man sing that song, and his eyeballs leave his head. He can't believe what he's seeing. You ever seen such a sight? The eyeballs just pop right out of his head. And Coyote began thinking to himself, this is something unusual. This is something perhaps I want. This is perhaps something that I can use for my advantage. That's what Coyote was thinking. And so Coyote goes up to the old man. He goes up to the old man and he asks him, teach me this trick. That's what Coyote said. Teach me this trick. But the old man said, this is no trick. This is a way of seeing the world. And in seeing it this way of honoring the world. That's what the old man said. Yeah, that's fine, Coyote said. But teach me this anyway. And so the old man took in Coyote. Took him in as his pupil, an apprenticeship. Taught him the song. Taught him how to sing his eyes out of his head. And sure enough, Coyote was a pretty good student. He learned that song and he learned how to sing his eyes out. Graduation day came on and Coyote was told at the commencement talk by the old man, you see, that in looking with the eyes, be sure to look in only the four directions. Only the four directions. That's fine. You know how sometimes you listen to commencement talks, and Coyote was not interested in that talk. So he went out. He wanted to try out his trick. He wanted to see with his eyes at the top of a tree. So he goes out, and he goes into a forest where you would find the tallest trees, the tall ones, to really try out his new trick. And so he's going over that ridge there and over that ravine and through over there, and he backtracks a little bit. He's looking for that tall tree. And there it is. Ooh, it's a tall one. He stands beside that tree, and he sings that song, just like the old man had taught him. He sings the song. And sure enough, his eyeballs just pop right out of his head, and they ascend to the top branch of that tree, just like they're supposed to. And there, Coyote looks around. He looks to the east, and he's looking to the south, and he's looking to the west, and he can't believe what he sees. He's never seen things in this way. He's never seen things in this way. And he begins realizing how successful he's going to be because of his advantage. I mean, think what you could do if you could have your eyeballs leave your head. Go to the next room and spy on people. Go over here, flying around here and there. He was thinking that way. An advantage would be his, and he would become famous. That's what he was thinking. He looked in the four directions, and he was going to be rich. It was getting late, and it was time to get back to his camp. And so he sang his eyes back into his head, and he was off. He was going back over this ridge there and along this ravine, this way and that. He was getting back to his camp, but he wasn't quite finding his way back. Something went wrong. In his haste to find that tall tree, he'd become lost. What's he going to do? How's he going to get out of that forest? Coyote's a pretty smart fellow. He knows what to do. He's got this trick, right? And so he sings this song, and his eyeballs pop out of his head. They go right up there, like they're supposed to, and they start looking around. And they find a way out. And they look, and they search, and they find a way out. That's all he has to do. It's pretty good. It's time to call his eyeballs back in. So he sings the song again very carefully. But nothing happens. The eyeballs remain in the top branch of that tree. They don't come back down to his sockets. He must have left out a word. So he very carefully sings the song again. Nothing happens. Sings it again. Nothing happens. What's he going to do? He can't climb up the tree. He doesn't have any eyeballs to see the branches. So he picks up some sticks and stones, searches around, and throws them into the sky, trying to knock his eyeballs off that tree, trying to bring them down. But usually the stone or the sticks hit him in the head. It's not working. He can't get those eyeballs, and it's a late afternoon. The sun is still hot, and those eyeballs are swelling up under the hot sun, and the crows are circling about ready to pluck those eyeballs out of that branch. What's he going to do? He's laying beside that tree. He's crying, which probably is a very unusual sight. I mean, after all, there's no eyeballs there, and water's running out of these sockets, and he's just laying there. He's beside himself, and I don't know why, but as he lays there, a little tiny mouse runs across his face. And as that little tiny mouse runs across Coyote's face, the tail of the mouse falls in the mouth of Coyote. And he bites down, and he's got something. And he picks it up, and he holds it. He's got an idea. Tells that mouse, "Mouse, you've got 2 eyes. I have none. Give me one of yours, or I'll squish you to death." That's what he said. Mouse thinks this over. The mouse is a family man. He has responsibilities to his children, his wife. 1 eye, why not? And so very carefully, have you ever seen a mouse eyeball? Little things. Very carefully, he plucks out his little eyeball and gives it to Coyote. And Coyote puts it in his rather large socket. Puts it in there, and he can see, but every time he moves his head, that little tiny eyeball rolls around in the socket, so it's kind of blurred vision. But the first thing he sees as he stumbles about is a huge buffalo bull. And he pulls out his rifle, and he goes over that buffalo bull, and he says to that buffalo, Give me one of your eyeballs or I'll shoot you dead. That's what Coyote said. Buffalo thought this over. He too is a responsible individual. He has a family to care for. He has 2 eyeballs. I'll give Coyote one of these eyeballs. A buffalo eyeball. Have you ever seen a buffalo eyeball? Whew, big fellers. He plucks out his eyeball and gives it to Coyote. Coyote takes it. Doesn't quite fit though. He's got big sockets, but they aren't that big. And so he has to go over this tree, and with this huge eyeball, this tree, he starts pounding his head against that tree to knock the eyeball in. It stays, but kind of droops. And the other one rolls around, and old man Coyote, he's gone. The story is a traditional story. It's used by the Cheyenne people and others to explain why sometimes we see different. Sometimes individuals don't see in the same way as other individuals. It explains why we don't see in the same way. Anthropologists and folklorists have suggested that oral literature, stories, have provided society with 2 very important functions. And what would those be? One is entertainment. Stories obviously offer some laughs, some smiles, some sorrows, some tears perhaps. Stories do entertain us. There's a story, for example, of the old Indian fellow over for a visit at the rancher's house. And the rancher and the old Indian fellow, they cared for each other very much. They were always looking out after each other. They had a good friendship. And the old man was over. And the host prepared a steak with all the trimmings. It was a good meal. And the guest, being a good guest, ate the food in record time. And being a good host, the rancher provided another steak with all the trimmings. And being a good guest, the old man, the Indian fellow, ate up the steak with all the trimmings. And being a good host, a third steak was given. And being a good guest, he worked at it and he finished it off. But after he finished it off, the host, the white rancher, said, kind of jokingly, you know, "Boy, I wish I had your appetite." At which the old Indian fellow said, "You've taken my land, you've taken my religion, you've taken my culture, now you want to take my appetite too?" Stories can entertain. But a second very important function of stories of oral literature has to do with education. And this is something we're all aware too. In the stories, we help enculturate our children. We teach them our basic values, our worldview, the skills they need as adults. Throughout our own lives, it's the stories that come to us that reiterate our identities, our categories of ourselves as well as others in the world around us. Stories help educate. They're like the custodians of our traditions. The heritage is kept within the stories, and from that heritage we can dream a future. Obviously, the old man and the coyote, there was a lesson to be learned there of how to relate to the world and perhaps not trying to see too much, and the consequences in trying to see too much if you dared to see too much. There are lessons to be learned, values of who we are and how the world is to be related to, taught in the stories. Well, one of the, I think, intriguing themes, particularly because it's so unique in comparison with Euro-American themes and stories, has to do with participation. It's a very prominent theme that you see in the oral literature of the American Indian, participating, teaching ourselves and our children that the world, you see, is not something simply observed. We're not simply up there on a high mountaintop looking down, as I am here now, but we're amongst each other. We're with each other. We're not observers, but we're participants in the world. The Indian experience lacked fellows like René Descartes. There is no Cartesian dualism separating my thoughts, me, from the physical world around you. There's simply a world of participation. Simply a world of participation. There's a basic truism that you see in the philosophy of the American Indian as reflected in the themes of the stories. What the world is what we are. And of course the corollary is true. What we are is what the world is. Each is an extension of the other. To alter one is to affect the other. There's an interesting story of a young man who spent a couple of years in college. And he came back after graduation, and he wanted to renew his ties with his family. So he decided to go out fishing with his grandfather. And it was good. It was a beautiful day, spring day. The sun was just right. They weren't so interested in fishing as they were just in listening to each other. He wanted to re-anchor himself in his Indian traditions, having been away from those traditions for a while. After a while, the old man asked the young man, Oren, "Who are you?" Immediately the young man said his name. But the old man shook his head. "That's not who you are." A little while later, again, the old man asked the young man, the college man, the man who had been away, "Who are you?" And this time Oren began thinking about his ancestry, his clan, his family, and he named his lineage. But still the old man shook his head and said, "This is not who you are." By this time, Oren was about ready to jump out of that boat and go ashore. The old man wasn't quite sure. A third time the old man asked the question, but this third time Oren remained silent, at which the old man began pointing out things that you could see. He pointed out to the children playing on that shoreline. "You see those children? That's who you are. But you see those birds up there flying? That's who you are as well. And the water here and the clouds and those rocks, all that which you see is who you are." Again, an extension, a participation in the world, a key theme in the oral literature of the American Indian. Now, interestingly, if you're following this idea of participation through the content of the stories, you also see it reflected not only in the content, the message of the story, but also in the way stories are told, the techniques of storytelling, which are very much participatory, asking you as a listener to participate in the word and the world. It's not only that the message speaks of participation, but the way stories are told, the storytelling talks of participation. And just give you a couple of dimensions of storytelling to get you a sense of the feel for this participatory act. When traditional stories are told today by Indian peoples, there's a tremendous amount of embellishment, of detail, of repetition that goes into the stories. A story may last hours. In our 60-second society and getting to the point so important, traditional Indian stories are tough to take in sometimes, because the old man or woman, once they get going in those stories, they'll just go on and on and on for hours. There was a couple who went to Europe in the early 1950s, for instance. They spent 6 months in Europe, and they had been from a reservation, a rural setting, and they went to Europe, where they were part of a dance troupe. They visited capitals, they met dignitaries, presidents, royalty. What a 6 months in Europe. You could imagine the story they had to tell their relatives when they got back home. And when they got back home, that's precisely what they did. They told the story. They gathered the family around, 20 or 30 individuals. They had their dinner, and the old man began with the embellishment and the repetition that is due a story, telling it, filling it up with a landscape, with a life. And by 3 or 4 in the morning, no one was still awake to appreciate that story. And he'd only told of going from the reservation to New York City. Hadn't even gotten on board the boat yet to go to Europe. A lot of detail. That helps animate the story. The point of the story isn't so much the moral as it is simply the process of doing it, you see. Storytelling among Indian peoples is very much a dialogue. You don't have a storyteller, you don't have a listener. You have individuals who are exchanging with each other. It's very awkward, for example, to tell stories from a stage. you need sort of an intimacy with each other, to be with each other, nothing separating yourselves. There is a dialogue. People would respond by saying yes, to the stories. You constantly hear this dialogue. It's not someone simply telling a story, but there's feedback. And importantly, when the feedback stops, if I no longer hear anything in the audience, I know you're no longer participating and the story should stop. So I need to hear something. There's a participation, even overtly like that. Language itself is very reflective of this participation. Native peoples, in the way they understand language, it's somewhat different from our own understanding. We use words, language, to describe reality. And we have a language that's very precise in that description. Indian languages do this too. But they have another dimension. They understand and use language not only to describe the world out here, set up a word describing an experience or an object, but they use that word, they have an understanding of it, to bring it about, to create that reality. A performative force, a power within the word. One of the very first lessons I learned on the reservation is that you never say goodbye to someone after a visit. Goodbye is too final. You say, I'll see you later. Diawagawik. The word itself helps influence the situation. You don't talk about disease. One of my first projects involved going house to house, knocking and asking people about how they were sick, previous illnesses. No one's going to talk about it. Why? Because the word itself can help influence and create that reality. There is a Crow expression, Crow people of Montana, dashushua, which literally means breaking with the mouth. That which comes through the mouth has the power to affect the world around you. You don't talk about bad things, hoping not to affect and create those bad things. An Indian name is so characteristic. In a ceremony, you're 3 months old, your grandmother has given you this Indian name. It's done in a ceremonial context. And everyone hopes the name, the words describing that name agree with you. If they do, you will become the name as you grow older. Language, words, understood in this way are extremely powerful. And then carry that through for storytelling. When a good storyteller is going to town and you're in that sort of magical situation, that reality is not somehow out there, but it's right within you. The words that are woven into this wonderful tapestry of a story, the threads of that tapestry involve the landscape, the animals, but they also involve you within the story. You become the old man. You become Coyote, or you may become Joe Stinks. There's an appropriate story that illustrates this assumption about language. You've heard of Joe Stinks, haven't you? Haven't you? You haven't? Joe Stinks? He's an Indian bronc rider. But as his name would indicate, he's not so good. He's bad. Here's the great celebration, a powwow, rodeo. It's the big event of the year on the reservation. Hundreds of people come from all over the country, from Canada, Arizona, Oklahoma, Montana, Washington. They come for this big celebration. It lasts all week. But we got Joe Stinks representing us. Terrible. So his buddies get together, give him a few bucks, tell him to go to the courthouse and at least change your name. Sounds good. And so he takes the money, goes to the courthouse, and changes his name. The big day's there. Big rodeos going on. Out of chute number 4, representing the great Coeur d'Alene tribe. Everyone's in the aisles and up in the bleachers anticipating at least a new name. Out of chute number 4, representing the great Coeur d'Alene tribe, comes Joe Stinks No More. And the chute opens, and he's on the ground in record time anyway. There is an assumption that the words we use create the reality. Let me share with you a longer story that perhaps will exemplify this theme of participation. And perhaps in the telling, you too can become part of that story. It's the story of Curtain Boy and Spring Boy, 2 hero twins. I first heard this story about 10 years ago, just prior to the Sundance ceremony in Montana. It's a traditional story, a Buffalo Day story, but still told today. In the telling of it, I'm retaining some of the rough edge of the story. Some of the parts of the story are rather harsh and even brutal, but those are always balanced with parts that are rather tender and caring. The emotional ride of the story itself suggests an extension of the emotional ride that you often experience on a reservation. The highs are very high and the lows are very low. The Indian experience is not an experience of the bland, but of the vivid, as the story perhaps will indicate. The story itself is about the hero twins. And they use their wit and intelligence to combat adversaries, monsters, evils, out there, and always succeed in their challenge. It's a story about optimism and hope. It's also a story because of the nature of these twins. They approach their adversaries with reckless abandonment, a carefree joy, a play. And perhaps the underlying theme is as much participation in the world out there as an acknowledgement that the monsters out there, those adversaries out there, are really never to be taken too seriously. And there's always some humor out there. Well, the story goes something like this. There's a young couple, and they care for each other very much. They live there up in the mountains alone. The young man goes out hunting each day. He hunts the deer and the elk, and they offer themselves up to the hunter. He brings back the meat, and with the bodies of those animals, the woman over here, she cuts the hides, prepares the hides for clothing, for moccasins, the meat, and they have a good life. They care for each other very much. One day the young man is out. He's hunting. And an old woman comes into camp, and she's not pleasant to look at. She walks with a hunched back and a cane, and her clothes are torn and soiled, and she's not pleasant to look at. And being a good hostess, the young woman brings out some food, but the old woman says, "I'll not eat my meal this way. I'll eat my meat only prepared on the belly of a pregnant woman." That's what the old woman said. And the young woman, being heavy with child, laid down and served the meal on her belly. And the old woman ate. And when she had finished that meal, the old woman pulled out a knife and killed the girl and tore open her belly and threw the two children, there were two boys inside the belly, threw them away, one into a spring over here and one into a lodge behind the curtain inside that teepee, and sat that woman up against the lodge and burnt a smile on her face and left. Her name was Red Woman, and she's not pleasant to look at. Later that afternoon, the young hunter came back. He's coming now, and he sees his wife here seated. He's coming, and he feels good inside. He's seeing her working away. She must be working, and she has a smile in her face, and he's feeling good inside. And he gets closer, but he becomes concerned because she's usually up, and they're running toward each other by now, but she's just seated there. She's just seated there. And then he gets closer, and he sees what had happened. How could this be? How could this be? And tears come to his eyes. He takes his own knife out and cuts the braids off his hair, and he mourns the death of that woman. He takes the body and built a scaffolding over here and puts the body up there and mourns the death of that woman he had loved so much. How could this be? Several days pass, and the old man, seated there, hears something. "Father, feed me, I'm hungry." And who should come out of the lodge and who should come out of this spring but full-grown boys. Full-grown boys. "Father, we're hungry, feed us." And the loss he had suffered is replaced by a love of his sons. And the boys explain what had happened, how an old woman, not pleasant to look at, came into camp. She was hunchback, and she made our mother lay down here, and when she finished that meal, she did this to our mother. But here we are. The boys are Spring Boy and Curtain Boy. And the father teaches those boys how to live in the land, and it's good. And he cares for those boys very much. He teaches them about things. One day, the father tells those boys, now boys, whatever you do, don't go over there. You see that ridge there? On top of that ridge, there is a huge tree. It looks dead. There's not a leaf on a branch, but it's not. Don't go there, boys. It's alive. If you go near there, that tree will come crashing down on you, and that'll be it. Don't go there, boys. So the boys say, let's go. And they're off. And they're running over there by that tree. And the tree sees them, and they see the tree, and they're running faster and faster toward that tree, and they're getting close to that tree, and they're getting real close to that tree. And that tree is about ready to spring down upon them. And just before they get to that tree, running as fast as they can, just before they get to that tree, they stop. But the tree comes crashing down anyway. And they're on top of it, breaking off the branches and making sure that tree stays down for good. They bring back some branches to their father for the fire that evening. And their father says, you boys are crazy boys. One day, father tells the boys, now boys, whatever you do, don't go in that valley over there. Don't go over there, boys. It's dangerous. In that valley lives a huge buffalo. It's gigantic. It's as big as this auditorium, boys. Don't go over there. All it will do is look at you, open its mouth, and inhale you in. And that'll be it. Don't go, boys. It's dangerous. So those boys say, let's go. And they're off. And they go to that valley, and they're running over there. And they see it's a huge... I underestimated the size. It's bigger than this auditorium. It's huge. And they're running as fast as they can. But right before they get to where that buffalo is, they quickly knock off some long saplings. Long saplings. They're up to something. Those boys are up to something. They cut them down and tie them to their back, and they're off. And there it is. It opens its mouth, takes a breath in, and the boys are sucked in. They wind up in the belly. It's kind of dark, but they can see a little bit. They look around, and over here in this corner, they see some decomposed people. Over here are some half-decomposed people, and back over here are some folks that have been recently sucked in, and they're over there talking away. So the boys go over and pay them a visit. They decide, they may not have too much time, so those boys are up to something. Let's have a dance. Let's have a powwow. It might be our last. And so, sounds like a good idea. And so, Spring Boy yells out as loud as he can we have a powwow in here? And this little tiny voice comes out, can we have a powwow in here? The buffalo hears this. Now, this is an awfully strange request. No one has ever asked to put on a powwow in his belly before. But he thinks it over, and boy, the status he would have, a powwow in my own belly. He's had other things in there, but never a powwow. Go ahead. It's going to be your last. And so those boys, remember those boys are up to something. They take down those long branches, those saplings, and they pound them in here, and they build a dance arbor. And some of the people who can start going over and poking around inside the belly, and they find that part of the belly that makes a sound that sounds just right, like a drum. Start pounding on it. And everybody who can, and not everyone can, some people are in a bad way. Everybody who can is up dancing, having a great dance. They're dancing away and having a great time of it. And at the height of the song, who should climb atop of the lodge, this dance arbor, but Lodge Boy, Curtain Boy. And he pulls out his knife and starts poking around. Looks here and here. And the buffalo's feeling these sharp pains. Stop that! Stop poking around in there. And then he finds what he's looking for. It's huge. Ba-lumpa, ba-lumpa. And with a great thrust, he jabs that hard, and it rips open, and this huge buffalo is huge now. You can imagine the amount of blood. This river of blood comes gushing out and washes everybody out the mouth of the buffalo. The decomposed people and the half-decomposed people and those that's recently sucked in. The buffalo's kicking and on his side and kicking, and pretty soon that's it. And the boys go back over. And now, a delicacy of Indian peoples, and many of yours, is the tongue. Makes good sandwiches. And so the boys go over. Now, this is going to be sandwich meat for months. I mean, big tongue. They cut off that tongue and tie it up and pull that tongue back to their father and give it to their father, who says, "You boys are crazy boys." Some time passes. I mean, we're talking embellishment. I'm abbreviating these stories now. These stories could go for hours. Another episode, though. The boys are gathered around. And the father tells those boys, "Now, boys, whatever you do, don't go in those woods over there. It's dangerous. Don't go in there. Because in those woods lives the snakes." You know about the snakes, don't you? Snakes are dangerous. Now, these aren't ordinary snakes. They have noses that are razor sharp, and they can dive into the ground and travel like lightning. Yeah, like lightning, and come up wherever they choose. Come up inside your foot. It's dangerous over there, boys. These aren't regular snakes. These are dangerous snakes. Don't go, boys. So those boys look at each other. Let's go. And they're off. And go into those woods. But before they get to those woods, they get an idea. And they stop along the way, and they look around, and there it is. Flat stones. And they put them in their breeches. Put those flat stones in their breeches. And they proceed into that forest. Doesn't take too long, and they realize this is the country of the snakes. I mean, there's snakes everywhere. Hundreds of snakes, thousands just dangling from the lodgepole pines. The ground is just moving with snakes. Everywhere you step, you're stepping on snakes. Have you ever been a place like that? Whew, that's not a place you want to be. Snakes everywhere. They get to the lodge of the chief snake, and they knock and ask to come in. The snake, they don't usually have company, but he invites them in. "Come on in, boys." Immediately, the boys sit down, and a half a dozen snakes dive into the ground and try to come up in the bottoms of those boys. But those boys are up to something. And those boys say, "Snakes, we've come to give you a gift." "A gift? Sounds good. We've come to tell you some stories." That's what the boys say. "We've come to tell you some stories." Snakes think this over, and it's a grand idea. No one has ever come and offered stories before. And so all the snakes gather around, hundreds, and they curl up, millions and millions, from the lodge poles here inside the lodge. They're just dangling, listening and waiting for the stories. And the boys start in. Remember last fall? And there was rain and mud everywhere, and how cold it was with the north wind, and how we had to take down the camp and move it. But how nice it was to set the camp back up and get some dry wood, and with buffalo robes over our shoulders, cozy around that fire and fall asleep. Remember that story? Or the story last winter when we were out tracking some elk, and the snow was deep. We could follow the tracks well, but when we finally got to that elk and got it, the journey back was so difficult. The meat so heavy. It was exhausting, but how nice it was to get back in the lodge where it was cozy and warm and eat some of that fresh meat, and with our buffalo robes over our shoulders, fall fast asleep. Or the time last spring, and the waters were high and cold from the winter runoff, and we had to move camp, and how nice it was to get around that story after story after story. You know what happens. Those snakes, every one of them fell asleep. I thought they were exciting stories, but those snakes fell asleep, every one of them. And those boys very carefully pull out their knives and tiptoe around and taking care of those snakes. One by one, they do them all in. It takes them a while. There are a lot of snakes there. But they take care of all the snakes, except for one snake. One snake, the chief snake, wakes up just in time and dives into the ground and comes up into the foot of Spring Boy. What's Curtain Boy going to do? He's going to have to operate. He cuts open the foot of Spring Boy to get that snake out, but the snake's gone up into the leg. Cuts open the leg, the thigh, cuts open the thigh. It's gone into the belly. Cuts open the belly, it's gone to the chest. Cuts open the chest. What's he going to do? The snake has gone into his brother's head. What's he going to do? So he cuts off his brother's head and puts it over a fire to roast the snake out. That'd get it out, won't it? Sure enough, that snake comes out. It comes out. Spring Boy's pretty mad. I mean, his brother's in a real bad way. And so he's about to do in that snake when the snake should say, give me another chance. If you give me another chance, I'll take this gourd over here and stick it on my tail, and I'll rattle. I'll make a noise before I strike. Sounds pretty good. But still, looking at his brother, he's in a bad way. He still wants to do him in. And so he takes out, remember that stone? Takes out that stone out of his breeches and scrapes the head of that snake flat so it can't dive into the ground and travel like lightning. Lets the snake go, and by golly, that's the way snakes have remained ever since. But his brother's not in a very good way. But no problem. He gathers all the parts up and puts it in a basket and builds a small sweat lodge. Heats some rocks red hot, brings in some water, and when those boys come out of that steamed lodge, out run Spring Boy and Curtain Boy. And they bring back a couple baskets full of snake meat and serve it to their dad. And their dad says, you boys are crazy boys. A couple more episodes quickly here. Well, not so quickly. We'll just see how they go. The boys are gathered around. The father tells those boys to stay away from that woman over there. She's bad. You'll recognize her because she's bad to look at. She's not pleasant to look at. She walks with a hunchback and a cane. Stay away from that woman. She's dangerous. Don't go. And so the boys say, let's go. And they're off. And they go running. And they find that woman. And as they get close, they know what to do. When they get close to that lodge where that woman lives, they change themselves into a bee and a butterfly. The butterfly lands on the stick of the woman, which is a very powerful stick. And the bee backs up and attacks that woman and stings her. And she's up, running fast, dropping her stick. And immediately the butterfly turns into Curtain Boy and has a stick. And the bee turns into the Spring Boy. And with that stick, they poke that woman and knock her down and pile up her lodge and light it afire. And she's gone. But from the blaze, from the fire, from that tremendous fire, out comes a voice. You can't keep me down. And they pile up some more wood to do in that woman, who's also known as Red Woman. They do her in. But all that's left is ashes. When the fire finally cools down, all is left is ashes. And a wind comes in, a powerful wind comes in and blows those ashes. And as those ashes hit the sky, you know what happens? They turn into these little gnats with digging sticks. She's still out there, so watch out. The father's gone one day hunting, and the boys say, it's time to wake up our mother. She slept much too long. And so they go over where she's at, that scaffolding, and they take 4 things that she had used. A grinding stone, a jug, a clay jug, a digging stick, and a bone awl, a needle. And one by one, those boys are beside that lodge where that woman is laying in that scaffolding, and they throw those things into the sky. Throw them so that they land on top of her. Mother, that bone awl is coming down. You better sit up. That's what Lodge Boy said. And she stirs a little bit. And the awl lands on her. The digging stick is thrown high into the sky. She'd use that to dig up wild turnips and carrots. And it comes down. You better sit up. And she stirs even a little more this time. The jug is brought out, a little heavier, throws it into the sky, and it's about to come down. Mother, you better sit up. And she sits up, but lays back down. Finally, the heavy grinding stone is brought out. Mother, it's time to get up. You've slept much too long. And with all their strength and might, they throw that high into the sky. And as it comes down, she gets up and she gets off that scaffolding. And they talk and they visit for a while. And they prepare the meal for the dinner. And the father comes back and he can't believe what he sees. Tears come to his eyes, and he simply watches his wife for 3 days without moving. Story of Curtain Boy and Spring Boy. The words I offered are stories that have been shared by Indian elders, and I'm simply relaying them to you. It is about seeing the world in a particular way and about participating in that way. And I think a way of closing is to paraphrase N. Scott Momaday. Maybe you've read some of his works. The Housemaid of Dawn won a Pulitzer Prize in Literature a few years ago. He's a Kiowa poet and author, N. Scott Momaday. And he said something like this. And I think it's a good lesson to learn from these stories and perhaps carry them out in our own lives. He said, we are what we imagine ourselves to be. We are what we imagine. Our best destiny is to imagine who and what and that we are. To go unimagined is the greatest tragedy that can befall. We are what we imagine. The Indian has imagined him and herself a certain way. And despite 150 years of assimilation pressures, of government policy, of missionary policies, of education, of poverty, they still keep a spirit alive. They still have a dream of themselves. And that dream has kept them going, in part because of the stories. They are who they imagine themselves to be, and we are who we imagine ourselves to be. Thanks.
Thank Dr. Frey for his storytelling this morning, and I want to thank you for participating in this morning's presentation. And remind you that at 1 o'clock this afternoon, Dr. Grover Krantz is going to talk about the Sasquatch. See you then.